reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus journeyed to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd accompanied him. As he drew near to the gate of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he was moved with pity for her, and said to her, "Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this, the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, exclaiming, "A great prophet has risen in our midst, and God has visited his people." This report about him spread through the whole of Judea and in all the surrounding region. The Gospel of the Lord. In August of 2006, 10 years ago, my twin daughters, Courtney and Christina, left home and they went away to Los Angeles to study in college, and they stayed there for 5 years. Now, during that time, of course, I missed having them back home, but on the other hand, I got to visit them in Los Angeles, and it's a nice place to visit. We saw museums and all kinds of sights, and of course, we went to the beach. But I think our favorite thing was to go north of Los Angeles to Malibu and to walk around in the hills and in the parks there. And in January of 2011, we went to a place called Malibu Creek State Park. And it's a beautiful place. There's great big mountain vistas and deep valleys. And even in January, there's a lot of flowers and blossoms and colors. And the best part was, if you walk about 1.5 miles from the visitor center, you come to the place where the television series MASH was filmed. And I got my picture taken in front of the signpost of the 407 7th Unit, which is still there. And so I read about the MASH units, and it turns out they were developed, they were invented by an Army medical officer named Colonel Michael DeBakey. And of course, this is the same Dr. Michael DeBakey who was the great surgeon who performed more than 60,000 surgeries in his career. And he practiced medicine until he was 99 years old. And he, for decades, led one of the great heart surgery programs in the world. Well, I read about him, and it turns out that he was also a great medical pioneer. He made a lot of discoveries and inventions. He invented the use of Dacron to replace blood vessels which were diseased, and he developed a number of devices, including the left ventricular assist device, and as I read about, he developed the MASH unit. And I wonder, how could a person accomplish so much in his lifetime? And I read about him when he was 99 years old. He received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award that can be given. And he spoke at the ceremony about his life and what motivated him. And he gave most of his credit to his parents. He said that they instilled in him a love of reading, a love of learning, and his mother even taught him how to sew, which came in handy for a surgeon. But then there was something else, and he spoke. We had an orphanage near Lake Charles, Louisiana, where I lived, and every Sunday we would go out after church to visit the orphanage. My mother would cook things and repair our clothes we had outgrown to give them to the orphans. One Sunday, she packed a cap that I liked. I protested. She reminded me that I had a new cap and I had parents to give me a new cap, and the child who was going to get my old cap didn't. I never lost that lesson. I carried it with me the rest of my life. And so in addition to being a very learned, capable man, he was driven by this very simple lesson in compassion. And he went to medical school and a surgery residency at Tulane University, and he became a very prominent surgeon by the time the Second World War began. And the Army told him that he was so valuable back home that he didn't need to enlist, but he thought he should do so anyway. It was his duty. And he served in Europe, and he treated a number of wounded soldiers, and he noticed that, tragically, in the time it took the wounded soldiers to get to hospitals that had surgical facilities, which were very many miles from the front, a number of them died of their injuries. And so he devised this MASH unit to deal with that. And the way he conceived it, it would have three components. Number one were the facilities. They had to be advanced, they had to be sophisticated enough to perform surgery, but they also had to be mobile in order to move back and forth as the battlefront changed. And so the answer to that was tents. Everything would be housed in tents. The surgery centers, the officers' quarters, the enlisted men's quarters, the latrine would all be in tents. And the second component was the transportation. You had to get soldiers to these facilities quickly, and that became the task of the medical evacuation helicopter, which you see when you watch the opening credits to the TV series. And then the third thing was the personnel, the surgeons, the anesthetists, the nurses, the support personnel who would be needed. And as the show depicts people like Trapper John and Hawkeye and Radar O'Reilly and Margaret Houlihan, these were generally fairly young people who'd come from all over to this place, and they were well trained. But the doctors and the nurses wouldn't be working in their usual hospitals that they were accustomed to. They would be working in tents, they'd be living in tents, and that was its own challenge, because when it got hot outside, it would get hot inside the tents, and when it got really cold outside, as it often did in Korea, it would get very cold inside. And they were always in danger of being shelled by the enemy. They were only a few miles from the front. And so there had to be something else there to keep them, to motivate them to stay and to treat the injured soldiers. And Dr. Deacon, he believed that these young people would have the same compassion that drove him in his career. Perhaps they would have received their own baseball cap lesson when they were growing up. And as the television show depicts, these young people were sometimes irreverent, they were sometimes disrespectful, they didn't get along with the Army ways very well, but they stayed and they did their job. And there's one statistic that tells how well they did their job. Of all the wounded soldiers who came to the MASH unit, 97.5% of them survived. And so we can say, just like the young man that we hear about in today's gospel, they were returned to their families. And so when we come to today's gospel, we hear about Christ coming to this village of Nain just as this young man was being carried out who had died, and he was the only son of this poor widow. And Christ, of course, restores him to life. And he does so moved by the same thing that motivated Dr. Deacon, by compassion. And I'd like to think perhaps in the bond of the Holy Family sometime when he was growing up that Christ received his own lesson in compassion, his own baseball cap lesson. And of course today's gospel reminds each of us that in our daily affairs, we should always be moved by that same force, by compassion. But I see something more here when I think about that picture that was taken of me in front of that signpost out in California. And again, if you look at the signpost and all the arrows pointing in the different directions, most of them American cities and American places, and they seemed to represent the place where the people at this MASH unit came from. And so we had Boston, Massachusetts, the hometown of Charles Emerson Winchester, and Toledo, which was the hometown of Corporal Klinger. And it reminded me that back where they came from, each of these people was capable of doing good, but it was only assembled together at this one place, at this one time, that they were able to perform this duty of restoring these wounded soldiers so that they could go back home again. Together, they brought the life-saving compassion of Dr. Hardebeck to the Korean Peninsula. And so we can think about the analogy of our church. Each of us in our homes, on our jobs, whatever, is capable of doing good, but it's only assembled together at the celebration of the Eucharist, where each of us has a part. We're part of the royal priesthood, that we bring the compassion of Christ, the compassion that we hear about today, into our community, into our world. And we believe, we are taught, that it is through this Eucharistic celebration that our compassionate Lord, the bread of life, comes forth to save all who come to Him, 100%. And that salvation, that restoration that He gives to them and gives to us, will last for all eternity.